or well, whatever. This is in the Healy book. Today we're going to talk about central concepts in diversity. A lot of what we're going to talk about has to do with black and white problems, and that's mainly because that's what the general population in the United States has observed. We'll talk about it as we come to it. How's that? Maybe. There we go. Some individuals arrange themselves and others into social categories based on select criteria, such as race, religion, socioeconomic status, political affiliations, and attitudes, sexual orientation, and gender. Now, if you think of the Navajo Nation, of course, your category has to do with race. There's primarily only indigenous people on the reservation, and therefore your category, where you live, has to do with who you are, with your race. But you can see how the others might potentially work. If you were Mormon, you potentially, or Church of Latter-day Saints, you would want to live near other people of the same faith. So you would potentially live in Utah. Maybe you'd live in Hawaii. They have a large population of Latter-day Saints as well. Idaho has a large population. Washington State has a relatively large population. So primarily what you'd want to do would be to live around people that were very similar to you. When I lived in Omaha, Omaha is 80% Catholic, but curiously, not all the Catholic churches agreed with one another. So if you're Italian, you live in the Italian neighborhood so that you would have an Italian priest in your church. If you're Irish, you would have an Irish priest. If you were Slovakian, you would want a Slovakian priest because they would understand you. They would understand the saints that you worshiped and whatnot. Socioeconomic status has to do with people that are really wealthy. They live in gated communities, in mansions. People that are middle class live in middle class suburbs, and then people who are lower in the socioeconomic status, they can't afford to live anywhere else, so they live in a poorer section of town. Political affiliations and attitudes. This is something that we're seeing with California. A lot of people that are conservative and from California. You have to remember that both Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon lived in California when they became presidents. Two of the most conservative presidents we've ever had. They lived in Orange County in California, which is just west of Fullerton County. Anyway, Fullerton County and Orange County are two of the most conservative places in the United States. And what we're seeing now in California, since they feel like they're getting no representation, then a lot of people are moving out of California and moving to Texas, strangely enough. And potentially they're moving to Arizona and New Mexico as well. But New Mexico and Arizona have that reputation of being a little bit more liberal, but Texas is fairly conservative. Sexual orientation, if you are LGBTQ plus, then potentially you'll want to live someplace where people don't look down on you. One of the traditional places in the United States have been the cities, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Boston. They all have their gay communities, but especially San Francisco. San Francisco has a reputation for being welcoming the gay community, and of course, gender is another aspect. Social categorizations can encompass several dimensions: numerical representation, minority versus majority. This is something that we've always noticed. When we lived in Oklahoma, we were fairly liberal, but Oklahoma was fairly conservative. When we lived in California, even though California has a reputation for being being liberal, the area that we lived in, which was right outside of Los Angeles and closer to that Fullerton County that I was talking about before, yeah, we were running into a lot of very conservative people. Power variations in social hierarchy, normative status, generally accepted or marginal traits of statuses, or statuses, normative status, and nationality, citizen and immigrant status. You can live some places where sexual orientation, if you're not heterosexual, then you're looked down upon. We're talking about normative statuses now. Around here, there's an awful lot of people flying Trump flags, so it gets kind of scary where we live. We've had our political signs torn out of the ground before, so well, that's just the way it works, I guess. According to Abrams and Hogg in 2010, people look at shared characteristics and distinguish their group from others. After placing a person in a group, the individual automatically highlights differences between themselves and members of the other group. The problem is, of course, that categorization creates in-groups and out-groups. If this happens, people tend to see the world in a socially biased way. A good example of this, hopefully you've never experienced this, except when you're in high school. When you're in high school, you're either in one group or another. Kids from another school were out groups. These weren't people that you had that much to do with, and of course, unless they were relatives or something. In groups, out groups, very real in high school. In 1950, 87% of men worked outside the home. Only 30% of women worked outside the home. The rest were housewives. And of course, this is a book from the 1930s or 1950s. And I told you that my mother was one of the only people in the neighborhood who actually worked. All the rest of the mothers stayed home and did whatever mothers did back then, cleaned the house and baked and took care of the children, the underage children. By 2000, the number of men working outside the home had decreased to 73%. The number of women working outside the home doubled to 60%. In 1980, the median working age was 32. By 2010, the median working age had risen to 41. This trend is predicted to maintain as the median working age in 2040 is projected to be 42. Initially, increased diversity tends to make people threatened, but with increased contact, negative feelings decrease. Acceptance may be due to increased contact, making people seem less threatening through shared membership. Sometimes contact can lead to increased hostility and bias, but positive results are are a more common result. So the more you interact with people that aren't like you, the more likely that there will be a positive result. In other words, you will not feel as hostile to that individual as you did before you came in contact with any of these individuals. The dynamic systems theory purports that no one is a casual observer to their fate. Genetics might set the course, but it is the individual reacting to their environment that creates the individual. One of the supports of the dynamic systems theory is epigenetics. Epigenetics is the concept that genes result in personal traits, but the way that the trait is presented is influenced by your culture, by your society, and by environmental contexts. Because of the huge influx of immigrants into the United States between 1880 and 1920, 60% of all people who immigrated to the United States came in at this time. All the white people that you know probably haven't been in the United States for very long. Their ancestors came to the United States sometime between 1880 and 1920. Now, one person that you will meet that doesn't fit this criteria is me, because my people came over here. Geez, we were here in the 17th century, and of course we've been causing trouble ever since. But there were a lot of people immigrated to the United States, especially people from Southern Europe, people from Eastern Europe. A lot of Catholics came in at this time. There were Russian immigrants coming in from Russia. Russian immigrants coming in from Russia. That makes sense. There were Jewish immigrants coming in from Russia. So there was a lot going on at this time. And in the United States, one of the things that happened, the eugenics movement started. Eugenics means good genes. In other words, we were looking for people, we only wanted people to come into the United States who had good genes. Now, if you think about what was going on in Europe at the time, between 1880 and 1920, the monarchies were still intact, so aristocracies in almost all the countries of Europe were still there, even in Germany. Germany didn't become a country until 1870. Uh, so before that, all of those little bitty, it was chopped up into 30 or 40 little bitty places, duchies, they used to call them. And they would belong to this person or that person. There were royal families in all of these places. So there were just tons of aristocracy all over the place, which made, if you weren't a member of the aristocracy, what did that make you? Well, that made you a peasant. That made you somebody that worked for a living. You either worked on the farm as a farm laborer, or maybe you owned a business in town, but you weren't part of the aristocracy. You were looked down upon. This was the class system that they had at that time. So one of the things that happened, people in the United States, of course, we didn't have that type of class system in the United States. So when people started coming over to the United States because of the myth that the United States was a place where you could become all that you could be. A lot of people came over to become rich. Carnegie, the Vanderbilts, all of these people started out as very poor, as relatively poor people. So this eugenicist movement, they were looking at these people and seeing peasants, people who couldn't read, because in Europe they didn't have universal education, because they couldn't read, because they had been peasants for eons. This movement, this eugenicist movement, started in the United States, trying to block the people from coming into the United States. One of the chief eugenicists was a man by the name of H. Goddard. He claimed that 87% of Russian immigrants and 83% of Jewish immigrants, 79% of Hungarian immigrants, and 79% of Italian immigrants had lower than average intelligence. In other words, they weren't as smart as Americans. Let's not let them be Americans. That was Goddard's idea. Race is a form of social grouping where observable physical characteristics distinguish a group of people that are linked to non-visible characteristics such as intelligence. The concept of race was rejected by biology over 4 decades ago. Differences between groups do exist, but they are rooted in social and cultural adaptations. Social scientists have known of the fear that white law enforcement personnel have dealing with black males for over 20 years. This started back in the night, and now it's over 30 years. This is 1992. When this was first identified, and now it's 2022, and we're still having problems. George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd by the police officers. There was just a shooting in where was it? San Antonio, where a policeman, this black man was eating his lunch in the parking lot, and he just shot him. And now, of course, theoretically, he's going to be arrested. This was actually used, this whole idea that black men are dangerous. This was actually used in the presidential race in 1988 to influence voters to vote conservative, to vote for G.H.W. Bush. And of course, the elder Bush actually won the election because of a commercial. And this is one of the pictures in the commercial, in the advertisement. This is an advertisement of, I can't think of the name of this individual's name, but you can see how scary he looks, almost crazed, non-human almost. Adolf Hitler was able to mobilize Germany under his Nazi philosophy by demonizing the Jewish population. His solution was to lionize non-Jewish Germans, or what he called Aryans, and attempt to exterminate the Jewish population in the world. Now, the funny thing about this word Aryan is he thought that it, or he was told, or whatever, that it meant people of Scandinavian ancestry, or the Vikings, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. But actually, this is a group of individuals that came out of India, out of northern India. They were fairly light complexioned, but they weren't anything like what he thought they were. I laugh about that, but so this word is there are actually Aryan people living in India, but they don't look like what Hitler thought they looked like. Genocide followed, and the death of over 6 million Jewish people followed that. Despite Thomas Jefferson's idealism in 1776, by the time the U.S. Constitution was written in 1787, the idea of African slaves being freed was a non-issue. This became a very hot political issue. However, there was a problem, and the problem was that the southern states, the northern states, had a lot more people in them. The southern states had a lot of farms and a lot of slaves, but they didn't have a lot of white people in them. So what they did in the South was they compromised with the people in the North. They were afraid that the Northern people would start dictating to them because of their political power, because they had more people. So they came up with a compromise. And the compromise was that each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a human. As ugly as that seems today, that was a compromise to keep the United States together back in the 18th century, and it was the only thing that induced the southern states to become part of the United States. Otherwise, they would each have become their own little country, and potentially what would have happened is France would have come in, or Spain would have come in, or England would have come in and knocked each state off one by one, and eventually they would have taken over the United States. Studying human diversity requires assumptions that there are some genetically based variations that differentiate people and sometimes groups, but there is more similarity and overlap than distinct differences. Biology is not destiny. You remember that 99.9% of our DNA is identical to one another. Gender roles are also social constructs. While physical size and reproductive differences exist between males and females, ascribed roles are primarily cultural. Culture ascribes women to primary child care. Culture also assigns the role of provider to men. This is not true in all cultures. It is just something that came out of Europe. Most biologists agree that skin tone is an evolutionary reaction to the sun and the need to convert sunlight into vitamin D. In climates where there is bright sunlight, humans have developed darkened skin to filter the sun. In cold climates, darkened skin was not needed. In fact, lighter skin allowed for more absorption of vitamin D. Intergroup mating further created skin tone differences, and so we have some people that are very dark and some people that are almost transparent. I have seen people whose skin looked almost blue because there was almost no melanin in their skin at all. And somebody who is oh, jeez, my brain isn't working today. The word will come to me in a moment. Anyway, the person that has no pigment in their skin, this individual literally has transparent skin. Misinterpretations of different adaptations has led to stereotyping, prejudice, which are negative attitudes. Stereotyping is grouping people together. Prejudice, which is negative attitudes, and discrimination, which is acting on negative attitudes. The difference between prejudice is having negative thoughts, and discrimination is where you act on those negative thoughts. And this is a picture from the turn of the 20th century. As you can see the Anglo-Teutonic is a handsome fellow, and the Negro is not nearly as handsome, and he's wearing beads around his neck, strangely enough. And here's the Irish Iberian. The English were trying to denigrate the Irish. Iberian Peninsula is the peninsula of Spain and Portugal. Research uses intergroup labels. We identify people as Asian. These are all what people from Asia look like. We use the term black. Black is the term we use, and this is what they all. These are the different skin tones of somebody who's considered black. Hispanic, white, and these are all people who were Hispanic, are Hispanic, or were Hispanic. Cameron Diaz, I recognize her. There's, gee whiz, I can't think today. Anyway, that's Raquel Welch. Not doing very well. Asian Pacific Islanders. That's what they look like. Latina, Latino. It's another label. White. There's some white people. Marilyn Monroe, Hillary Clinton, Bill Gates. Geez, I know all the white people. Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, Roosevelt, Elvis, Robert De Niro. Oh, she's back again. Raquel Welch, Benjamin Franklin. Okay, that's Madonna. That's the first man on the moon, Armstrong, Neil Armstrong. John F. Kennedy, Teddy Roosevelt. In most states, the white population is a majority population, but there are some exceptions. And here are some of the exceptions. Hawaii is only 22.7% white. The rest of the population is a myriad of minorities, and these are the breakdown of all the people. There's your white population, 22.7, Hispanic 8.9, Asian 38.6, American Indian, Alaska Native 0.3%, Black 1.6%, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander only 10%. Two or more races 23.6%. The District of Columbia 65% minorities, and there's a white population. This is a black population. As you can see, it's primarily black. Hispanic and other mixed non-Hispanic is red. Okay. New Mexico, 60% non-white. Most of the people in the state of New Mexico are Latino, 46.3%. White people, 40.5%. American Indians, 8.5%. There you go. 60% of California's population are minorities as well. Only 41% of the population are white. 29% are non-Hispanic white, 13% are black, and 13% are Asian. Even dyed-in-the-wool white Texas is only 45% white. Hispanic population is, 37.6%, while whites only represent 45%, blacks represent 11.48%. Vermont, 94.3% white. We need to remember that there is a great deal of diversity within diversity. Heritage, generations in the United States, physical appearance, identification with heritage, cultural practices. A good example would be indigenous peoples of the Americas. The differences between all 74 recognized groupings, different heritages, different generations, potentially different physical appearances, and cultural practices, certainly. But of course, we could say the same thing about the white population. And when we talk about the different groups, we're going to talk about the differences, all of these differences. I mean, we try to lump everybody together. All black people are the same. All white people are the same. All Hispanics are the same. All American Indians are the same. But the reality is, of course, there's a lot of diversity within diversity. Often people will refer to someone from the United States as an American, but of course, an American can be anyone living in the Americas, North, South, or Central. They don't even speak the same language. The green portion is the Spanish-speaking population. This is Portuguese. There's some more Spanish-speaking people. Of course, that has to do with territories. But the Dutch were in Suriname, the purple area, that's Suriname. French Guiana and Dutch Guiana. Stereotypes are generalizations about groups of people that are exaggerated, overly simplistic, and resistant to disproof. Stereotypes assume that a few general traits about a group are accurate, and so apply to them to all members of the group, regardless of individual characteristics. Albino was a word I was trying to think of. Somebody who has no pigment is known as an albino. Oh, you just watched my memory process. Congratulations. Highly prejudiced people will maintain their stereotypes even in the face of massive evidence that their views are wrong. And of course, these are stereotypes. I'm a punk, so I must be rebel. I'm Asian, so I must like math. I dye my hair crazy colors, so I must be looking for attention. I'm a person, so I must be stereotyped. People low in prejudice tend to be familiar with stereotypes, but pay little to no attention to them. People with high levels of prejudice judge people using their stereotypes and judge their worth using these negative ideas. People with high levels of prejudice are able to confirm their stereotypes through selective perception, only perceiving evidence to reinforce their negative stereotypes. Often, derogatory stereotypes reflect the reality between the dominant and minority group relationships. Stereotypes of African Americans as lazy might stem from the passive-aggressive reluctance of blacks to labor during slavery. Stereotyping Jewish people as miserly might reflect the common banking practices of all bankers in the early 20th century. Stereotypes content model contends that stereotypes are perceived on two dimensions, warmth and competence. And of course, the Cleveland Indians are no longer the Cleveland Indians. They are the Cleveland Guardians. So this cartoon probably will make no sense to anybody 10 years from now. Groups, stereotype content model, groups high in warmth and low in competence are the elderly and housewives. Groups high in competence but low in warmth are Asians and Jewish people. Groups low in both warmth and competence are people on welfare and poor people. Prejudice has three components. Cognitive component, irrationally based beliefs about a target group. The affective or the emotional part, the feelings of dislike you have for this select group. And behavioral disposition, a tendency to avoid or harm the target group if you possibly can. Social psychologists have had the same definition for prejudice for the past 60 years. Ethnic prejudice is an antipathy based on a faulty and inflexible generalization. It may be felt or expressed. It may be directed toward a group as a whole or toward a person because he is a member of that group. And this is according to Allport in 1954. Individual ideas are expressed as a negative attitude about an entire group that results in directly discriminating against a person belonging to a discriminated group. This often results in the disadvantaged group accepting the majority group's opinion and allowing the discriminatory behavior to predict the outcome. Thus, if the majority feels that the minority group will not succeed academically, the minority group allows themselves to fail academically because that is the expectation, that they will fail. Discrimination is an action that demonstrates a prejudice. Procedural justice is concerned with making and implementing decisions according to fair processes. Distributive justice is concerned with the fair allocation of resources among diverse members of a community. Fair allocation typically takes into account the total amount of goods to be distributed, the distributing procedure, and the pattern of distribution that results. Biases are maintained consciously and unconsciously. Explicit biases are preferences for and against a social group that a person is aware of and can consciously control. Implicit biases are preferences for and against a social group that a person may be unaware of and thus cannot be consciously controlled. Both types of biases may or may not be expressed in the individual's attitudes, evaluations, or behavior. Researchers have been able to develop a test to measure implicit bias by measuring reaction times to racially charged visual and linguistic cues. The test is called the Implicit Association Test, developed by Greenwald, McGee, and Schwartz in 1998. Research with whites shows that they tend to show a fairly strong implicit bias against blacks, but work at Ashford University that I was involved with has shown that the bias is weaker in younger whites than in older whites. I had a student that did the IAT with the younger people, and he compared the scores that he got with his classmates who were in their late teens or early 20s with the results that they got that are generally published from Harvard University, where they developed the implicit association test. And he got far lower results, which is a good sign. It's a good sign that, that bias may be decreasing with time. Social bias is a compendium of personal attitudes, laws, institutional policies, and informal practices that perpetuate race, ethnic, and gender biases. They can happen whether a specific people intentionally drive the processes or not. Social bias, we wish for white people only. This is from the Old South. Christians only, Jews not allowed, danger. We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. These were actually signs in select places around the United States. Racism is based on three assumptions. A group's behavioral characteristics are assumed to be biological, and nature created distinct and unbridgeable differences between races. My race is superior to any other. That is the idea. No matter what your race is, that is your idea. My race is better. My race is better than your race. Society creates institutional policies and cultural practices that allow hierarchical domination of one group based on the first two assumptions: that someone's race is superior. And the reason that people act the way they are is because of biological aspects that there's nothing that they can do about. The U.S. has a long history of racism that started with the European antipathy inherited by warring nations. All the European nations practiced a caste system that started with a monarch and ended with slaves. To make matters worse, the Christian church in Europe was very protective of what would and wouldn't be allowed in their religion. When new ideas were proposed, the church very rapidly quashed the blasphemy and declared war on the heretics. The early crusades were mostly against blasphemous Christian sects. It wasn't against the Muslims in the Holy Land. It was against different sects of Christians, people who claimed to be Christians. This absolutist mindset led to frequent travesties against people who were different, and so when it came to people who spoke or looked different, it was an easy transition from acceptance to rejection. This made the practice of serfdom easy, and the short journey to slavery followed. This idea was brought to the Americas and were hard to completely discard. Jefferson may have tried in the Declaration of Independence, but within 2 decades he was part of the compromise government that agreed that a slave would be counted as 3/5 of a human. Jefferson's ideals did not dissuade him from raising and selling of Africans to support his plantation. Bias, person to person, is also referred to as individual bias. Individual bias is expressed as a negative attitude about an entire group that results in discrimination toward a member of that group. Centuries-old attitudes perpetuated through the parenting practices and institutional and cultural biases often result in personal expressions and actions of superiority and or inferiority. And this is part of individual bias as well. And this is a man who's laughing about the fact that he has an Obama hat on top of a monkey, stuffed monkey, and of course the Ku Klux Klan. Individual biases. Often institutional biases are couched behind the excuse of tradition and are not always obvious. Therefore, they are often implicit biases. When one group is in control, institutions like corporations and universities tend to favor the dominant group at the expense of the minority group. When institutional bias exists over time, unequal outcomes can be demonstrated through social indicators, measures of social outcomes using statistics, such as employment rates and healthcare statistics. Infant mortality rates is another one. Institutional bias is the extension of personal bias beliefs that become incorporated into social institutions or practices so that some groups maintain a consistent advantage over others. Public education is a good example. Public education is paid through property taxes, which are lower in poor neighborhoods. What do we have here? Educational segregation. This is the way it was in the United States. You can see all the states that were segregated before the 1950s, before Brown versus the Board of Education was passed. That was passed in 1954, I think. But it didn't. It wasn't implemented until much later, until the 60s, or in some cases the 70s. So you can see how much segregation there was in the United States. Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, Virginia, and West Virginia. Those are the states that had segregated schools. So now we've resegregated the schools. Places where there are a lot of private schools have resegregated, and sometimes they have resegregated for reasons of race. And as you can see, this is fairly common in the Old South, but it's also common here. Oh, that's because of parochial schools. These are Catholic schools primarily, and Jewish schools in New York. They have a large Jewish population. There are more Jews living in New York City than there are in all of Israel. There are more Jews living in the United States than there are in Israel. Wisconsin, what is Wisconsin? Lutherans, and same way with Nebraska. Anyway, culture is our social reality. Culture is how reality is represented over generations, transmitting your beliefs, your knowledge, your standards, your values, your ways of thinking, and your way of feeling. Culture is very strong in the Dene population, but you can imagine that all people are learning their own culture somehow from their parents or from their community, just like the Dene people do. They don't focus on it quite as much, but if you look at a textbook that from Indiana or Pennsylvania or South Carolina, they're all teaching culture, the white culture, because that is the dominant culture. It is maintained through symbols such as writing and other artifacts. A good example would be Santa Claus, St. Nicholas. This is St. Nicholas. This is St. Nicholas in Holland. And this is what St. Nicholas actually looked like. There we go, old St. Nick. This is England, I believe. And there he is when he when he was first adopted in the United States. And you can see he doesn't wear red for the longest time, carrying his Christmas tree in Germany. There he is. This is actually from Germany. It's St. Nicholas Day, which is, I think, December 12th, if I'm not mistaken, in Germany. And there he is in the United States now, of course. And now, cultural bias is probably the deepest form of bias because it is often based on historical aspects that may no longer be in anyone's memory, but is taught to every succeeding generation as truisms that can't be argued against. The bias has become part of the culture. Cultural bias comes in play when the individual is taught that their cultural heritage is superior to all others due to their skin color, their ethnicity, their religion, their gender, and possibly even their sexual orientation. When one culture comes into conflict with another, as in war, the differences can be exaggerated. In the Pacific Theater during World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, the U.S. military struggled with the idea that suicide was a legitimate means of warfare. We still struggle today dealing with suicide bombers in Afghanistan and Iraq. How can they hate us so much that they're willing to allow themselves to die in order to kill their enemies? But all of these countries are collectivist countries where the group is more important than the individual, something we as Americans do not accept culturally. Jones in 1997 and then again in 2004 found that white and black cultures differ across 5 dimensions: their sense of time, their sense of rhythm, their sense of improvisation, their oral expression, and their spirituality. The dominant culture tends to favor future time orientation, such as saving for the future. The dominant culture favors stable and predictable rhythms. Routine is the spice of life. The dominant culture seeks planned activities over improvisation. The dominant culture appreciates written over oral expression. The dominant culture favors personal control over spirituality. Cultural universalities do exist. Reciprocity, repaying a kindness with a kindness, seems to be universal. Revenge, repaying harm with harm, seems to be universal as well. All cultures also seem to struggle with conservatism, keeping things the same, versus being progressive, changing things to make them better. All cultures seem to struggle with helping the needy and maintaining personal gain. So now we're going to talk about how research is done in the social sciences, in social work as well as psychology. I wrote my dissertation on resilience, and about a third of my research came from nursing journals, about a third of it came from psychological journals, and about a third of it came from social work journals. As a matter of fact, the instrument that I used to measure resilience was actually a nursing survey, and the instrument that I used to measure culture was from social work. Social scientists determine the mechanisms of bias and discrimination by developing theories and hypotheses and testing them using the scientific method. The scientific method begins when a scientist observes a social phenomenon. Curiosity causes the scientist to research the phenomenon to determine if there is a definitive information, if there is any definitive information dealing with the phenomenon. If the scientist observes or discovers a flaw or a lack of information dealing with the phenomenon, they will develop alternative explanations for the phenomenon. At this point, they will develop theories to explain the holes in the knowledge of the phenomenon. If the lack of knowledge is significant, the scientist may decide that there is a need to prove their theories through an experiment or experiments. The scientists will form their theories into testable hypotheses. From these hypotheses, the scientists will develop a dependent variable or the major point of the phenomenon that they are testing. The scientists will also develop one or more independent variables to manipulate to determine if the independent variable is actually changing. The scientists will have to decide what kind of experiment they want to conduct and how they want to assign individuals to groups. The strongest research is research that tests everyone in the research population, and this is known as a census sampling. But if we're talking about a generalization, if we're talking about a small group of people, it's possible to do census sampling. But if we're talking about a larger group of people, if you were talking about all the Dene people on the Navajo Nation, that's over 200,000 people. The probability that you could test everyone would be fairly remote. So it's usually prohibitively expensive. I mean, printing all of those surveys, if you were doing a survey or trying to talk to all 200,000 members of the Navajo Nation, that would be almost impossible. Another way to select people for the experiment is to randomly select them. Will eliminate any bias in selection, and that's known as random sampling. A third type of sampling is used when the test subjects are difficult to identify. If the scientist can identify one individual from the group, they can recruit other members of the group, and this is known as snowball sampling. Since social science is dealing with real people in the real world, they are rarely able to control all the variables dealing with their subjects. For example, there's nothing a social scientist can do to control the diversity of a neighborhood where an individual grew up. For this reason, much of the research in social science is quasi-experimental design than an experimental design because of the lack of controls over extraneous variables. It's a quasi-experimental design. Often social scientists will compare manipulated variables from their experiments with naturally occurring variables that they have merely observed. This is called correlations. Correlations plot similarities between the two variables along an axis that ranges from -1 to +1. It's a total of 2. -1 is 1, and +1 is another 1, so that makes 2. So it's a difference between two extremes, and those extremes encompass 2.0 of a spectrum. The stronger the correlation, the more positive the number. The more negative the correlation, the more negative the number. For example, social scientists have found that historically, as economic stress has increased, expressions of prejudice and discrimination have also increased. A research design must be selected that tests the hypotheses and controls the variables. The social scientists may choose direct observation in a laboratory, such as the Milgram Experiment. The Milgram Experiment was trying to find out how obedient people were. So they brought people in and they told them that they were doing educational research, and that these individuals needed to, they needed to read an individual a set of questions. If they missed a question, that they were supposed to shock them. They were trying to find out if electricity or shocking somebody made them learn faster. That was what they said. So that, and like I said before, this was a test of obedience. So they were trying to see if somebody would actually do that. And as it turned out, 65% of the people actually did that. There were 35 that refused, that were non-obedient, but 65% were obedient. Took the guy all the way to the end of the voltage. The social scientist might choose it in a real-life setting, and that would be social prejudice experiment. Here we go. This is kind of painful.
This woman is shopping in an upscale New York City boutique.
It's
actually more of an upscale store. I'm not sure if you'll find anything that you're looking for.
She is looking for a new outfit, but the store's employees are on the lookout for people like her.
I don't need you any further in the store because I can't keep my eye on you. People like you come in and they take things.
People like me?
I think you know what I'm talking about. I don't feel comfortable with you in the store.
Keep your eye on these two women.
Not sure you can actually afford something like this. Let me fold this back.
The more offensive the sales clerk is,
Ma'am, people like you, they can't afford stuff like this.
the more they keep their attention on the merchandise. We catch up with the two women outside.
I did actually feel sorry for the girl.
Will you do something next
I wouldn't
time?
have got involved, no, because it's nothing to do with me.
But she needed your help. Someone has to sound the alarm.
But I don't know her.
The two customers have just witnessed a type of discrimination so common that researchers have given it a name: shopping while black. In a recent survey, 60% of African Americans say they have experienced it. And sadly, it has all the makings of a perfect what would you do experiment. In our scenario, actors portray a store clerk, a security guard, and a shopper who we dressed up and down. She is the target of the abuse. We wanted to see if any of the other shoppers will do anything at all. Our base of operation is in one of the shopping capitals of the world, Soho in New York. And we find practically the only store willing to experiment with something so controversial: a women's boutique called Pomela.
People like you come in and they just slip things in your bag.
What
You have
is-
big
what is
jacket and
people like
everything.
me?
I think you know what I'm talking about.
I
If you
don't
need to
know
shop
what
in Harlem, go shop in Harlem. You're not shopping in our store.
Inside the store, the harassment continues.
Put your arms out, please. It's not the first time, I'm sure. You know what I'm talking about.
Excuse me, I've been searched and I'm just a shopper. Did this happen to you?
No response here. And just seconds later, she's back to primping.
What is your name? Are you the manager?
Yes, I'm just doing my job.
You're doing a horrible job, okay? You treat me like I'm a criminal.
Watch this couple. They've been browsing right next to our actors.
You're really disturbing them.
They should know that they shop in a place where paying customers get frisked. I'm the only black woman in here,
Right,
and I'm the only person this is happening to.
exactly.
Our security guard tries to draw the couple in.
I don't go to your neighborhood. Why don't
You don't go
leave
to
our
my neighborhood. You
Yes.
don't even know where I live.
Sorry,
I'm so
guys.
sorry,
That's all right.
guys. Did y'all need help looking for anything? or-
We're just looking for something that she might like.
But not a word in defense of our shopper. And we couldn't believe what happened next.
Have you guys ever experienced something like that? It's just crazy.
What's that?
What someone like her coming in and I mean she looked very suspicious. I had two ladies like that come in last week. It just looks like they're gonna do something. You know?
Probably to play the black card, right?
What did he just say?
You know?
Probably to play the black card, right?
Yeah, I guess it just seems like it's more black people than it is than others.
We're doing an experiment on racial profiling, and it was all a scenario we staged called "What Would You Do?"
bad.
Suddenly, it seems, he changes his tune.
Called, "What Would You Do?"
bad.
Well, she's okay, but it could have been real. Do you feel it was your role to step in and defend her at all?
Would you have defended me?
Yes.
Meanwhile, back inside the store,
Why do I have to leave? I didn't do anything wrong.
This is preventative, loss prevention.
You're throwing me out of the store because I'm black.
notice this customer is having a hard time concentrating on the merchandise. A few minutes later, and just as we did with the man before her, we instruct our sales clerk to engage her.
I think it's probably more of appearance than, just that kind of people. Like the probability is just higher.
What does that mean, that type of people? I don't understand.
The statistics are higher for people of different
what?
types.
Type, you see, that's the problem. That type, I'm afraid of what you're going to say when you clarify what type means.
Yeah.
That's really disturbing
But
to
it's
me.
the facts, and I think it's just.
Oh my goodness. You are saying what I think you're saying. I wish you would just stop asking me about
Honey.
this and talking to me.
She's so upset, she begins to cry. It's time to introduce myself.
Hi, I'm John. I'm John Quinones. I'm the reporter with ABC. Do you know this is part of the experiment, right? We didn't want you to be that upset. We did want to find out how people would react and what should they do and what should they say, because this exists. Racism does exist.
Ma'am, your type comes in here a lot, and I just need
My
to make
type?
sure. Yes.
This man and his family have a front row seat.
Yes.
Yes. No, sir. I've had trouble with.
Maybe they've heard a little too much.
You're upscale. She's not.
You know how embarrassing it is to do this to her?
No.
Why are you singling her out like that?
Because look at her.
Look at her. What?
I've tried to protect this store.
Let's go.
Sir,
Stung by the insults, he tries to leave, but our sales clerk won't let him go.
we had this happen last week, and I need to make sure that it doesn't happen. It comes out of my
I don't,
pocket.
listen, I'm not stating that you shouldn't do your job, but the way
Yeah.
you're doing your job isn't right.
So
You
how would
cannot
I
go-
do it if
You don't need to be working if you don't know how you would do it.
He's finally had enough.
But you should apologize. That's cold. That's sick. That's sick.
Excuse me, sir. Hi, I'm John Quinones.
Man, I can't talk right now.
I know you're upset.
Go ahead.
You know what
I can't
this was?
talk.
You know what this was? It's an experiment on racism, and a lot of people didn't say a thing. And it's a wonderful thing you did.
I usually don't say anything, but I couldn't sit there because it wasn't security after a certain point.
You came to my rescue. And no, seriously, it's so humiliating. It's embarrassing. I've been followed around in stores before. I have to be conscious of the way I dress before I go shopping.
Almost 100 people witness our scenario, and less than 20 intervene. It was clear from our experiment that people of color feel the most strongly, but we were surprised by some of the other folks who decided to step in.
I just don't feel comfortable right now with you in the store. I'm sorry, and I can't subject them to this.
I think you should put in a complaint. So, as somebody who's shopping, you've done nothing wrong.
I've had people like her come in, and this is what happened. I need you to frisk her, please.
She's done nothing. I'm
Check her
just.
bag.
I have not done anything wrong.
Turn around.
I've got to get to your store as a customer.
Our security guard ignores the women's pleas and moves in.
Put your arms out.
You, definitely.
And just like that, the two women decide to leave the store and take our shopper with them. And an entourage of angry customers follow.
She's been completely humiliated by this woman.
Outside, the crowd is so caught up in the moment, they begin talking to our camera crew, not realizing they're part of our show.
What should people do?
Well, I think she should put in a complaint for one thing.
I have a confession to make.
What's that?
This is all part of an experiment
I know,
on racism. She's an actress. And she's an actress.
And a good actress too. Well done, you got us.
But it's a great store. The owner's Jimmy.
Hi guys, I'm so sorry. I'm so happy you guys stuck up.
Can I try my clothes on now?
Yes, of course. Please.
Okay. Ouch. That hurts. That's painful. Okay. There we go. The social scientists might choose surveys, attitude scales, or other self-report measures. And this is a survey from Lancet, which is the... Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. This is a survey from Lancet. We're not going to watch all of it.
The British National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, or NATSAL, is one of the largest studies of sexual behaviour of its kind. First conducted in 1990 and again in 2000 and 2010, the most recent report combines the results of over 45,000 respondents, recording the dramatic changes in our sexual lifestyles over the past 60 years. Over time, we've been able to observe a decline in age at first sexual intercourse, an increase in the number of lifetime sexual partners, and an expansion of heterosexual repertoires and more varied sexual practices. Our attitudes to relationships have changed, with increasing acceptance of same-sex partnerships and greater disapproval of non-exclusivity in marriage. Reporting of recent sexual activity declined with age, and older people had lower levels of sexual satisfaction, with those in poor health reporting decreased sexual activity and lower satisfaction independent of age and whether or not they had a current partner. When asked whether they felt their health affected their sex lives, about 1 in 6 people said that it did. Of these, only 1/4 of men and 1/5 of women had sought any clinical help or advice. The third survey provides information on the prevalence and risk factors of 4 key STIs. The most common of these is the human papillomavirus, HPV. Certain high-risk types of HPV are associated with an increased risk of cervical cancer and were found in nearly 1 in 6 women aged 16 to 44. chlamydia affected slightly more than 1% of the population, peaking in younger age groups, whereas gonorrhea and HIV affected less than 1 in 1,000 and was limited to those with recognised high-risk factors. Sexual health clinic attendance and HIV testing uptake have increased significantly over the last decade, especially by those at highest risk, in line with national strategies to improve access to services. NatSouth 3 has produced the first reliable estimates of the number of unplanned pregnancies in Britain. Around 1 in 10 women aged 16 to 44 experienced a pregnancy in the past year, of which 16.2% were unplanned and 29% scored as ambivalent. While pregnancies among 16 to 19-year-old women are more likely to be unplanned, the majority of unplanned pregnancies occurred among 20 to 34-year-olds. NatSouth 3 is the first of the surveys to ask women and men about their experience of sex against their will, or non-volitional sex. Non-volitional sex is more commonly, but not exclusively, reported by women and is predominantly an experience of younger age. In the majority of instances, the perpetrator is someone known to the individual. Overall, among women, current or former intimate partners form the greatest proportion of perpetrators. Significant barriers to reporting remain, with less than half of women and a third of men indicating that they told someone about the event, and fewer still reported it to the police. The dramatic changes in sexual lifestyles that have been captured by the 3 NatSouth studies present both public health challenges and opportunities. Public health programs need to embrace the evidence of change to ensure that services and preventative interventions are appropriate for current lifestyles and that their aims are consistent with a broader definition of sexual well-being.
Okay, good job, Lancet. A social scientist might search archival records, and once again, I have lost my arrow. There we go. Okay, this is the one we're not going to watch all of.
Sometimes, if you're lucky, you will have something you can study without having to go out and find it. For instance, if you work for a program or company that holds onto information about clients, then you already have the client data that you can study. Or, if you don't work for a company but have access to research papers, then you also have data at your fingertips. Archival research is analyzing already collected data. It is looking at what is already in hand and applying statistical measures to it to describe the information in a simpler way. For example, a stack of random information about clients can be turned into a representative statistic, such as the average age, the average income, gender, and ethnicity. If you work at a psychological service center, you and your employees will see dozens, if not hundreds, of clients a day. That's a lot of people in and out of your doors. Let's say a financier comes along and wants to help by providing your center with a donation. This is really good news since the other sources of money have been recently drying up. However, before your financier will give you the donation, they want to make sure that you're providing adequate services. This means you and your staff will need to perform an evaluation of your clients. Now, to get the grant, you and your employees must use your
Okay, there you go. Anyway, archival research. Researchers will use direct observation and experimental design laboratory studies to study group dynamics on neurobiological bases of biased behavior. Attitude scales and self-report measures are used to study how targets of prejudice cope, how feelings and beliefs about one's own group compare with those about other groups, how self-aware participants are about their feelings. 2 types of statistics are used to report results in social science. Descriptive statistics describe the characteristics and general shape of the data. A mean and standard would be examples of that. And inferential statistics used to test the researcher's hypothesis to see if the hypothesis makes sense. And that would be a t-test. Examples of that would be a t-test, a chi-square, and an F statistic. And that is the end of the chapter. So there you go. I'll talk to you next week. Have a good week.